Okay, I wanted to just set up a brief podcast to take a look at the different types of data collection that you might utilize. I think this will be really helpful as you start to determine exactly which behaviors you're going to be addressing in your autism inquiry projects. Then you need to start thinking about how are you going to measure these behaviors and what type of data are you going to collect. And so I know that Dr. Roof has already talked to you guys a little bit about this in connection to your video modeling projects, but I thought I would just do a quick podcast to reinforce some of some of that information, and just to give you some additional information on data collection types. So let's start by talking about event recording. Event recording is really just frequency counts. It's just the total number of times that the behavior occurred during an observational time period. So event recording is ideal for behaviors that you're trying to increase or decrease. And it's ideal for behaviors that are discrete in nature. That is, it's clear when the behavior ends and when the behavior begins. We don't want to use event recording if it's difficult to tell when an instance of the behavior stops and another instance of the behavior begins. It can also be ideal for behaviors that occur regularly. We don't want to necessarily use event recording if the behavior is only occurring one or two times during the observational period. We want to use it for behavior that's occurring regularly or frequently, but not necessarily a behavior that's occurring constantly. So a behavior that has a long duration, or that occurs once and that instance of the behavior continues for a long period of time, then event recording might not be the best tool to capture that behavior. So event recording, it's simple, it's easy to interpret, and it's used frequently for lots of different types of behaviors, so maybe it is something that you will consider using in your projects. The other one I'd like to talk about is duration recording. Duration recording is just that. It is recording how long a behavior lasts for, the length of time that the behavior lasts, and it can be really useful for measuring behaviors that occur at a high rate, or behaviors that occur over a long period of time. So oftentimes it's used for things like off task or engagement or out of seat, where it can be expressed as a percent of time that a student is engaged in that type of behavior. So maybe you might do a 30-minute observation or a 20-minute observation of a student and use event recording to record how much time during that 20 minutes, how much total time during that 20 minutes the student spent off task or disengaged. And that can be useful for those types of behaviors. And really, it's just a measurement of the length of time that a particular behavior occurs. There's another type of duration behavior called latency, and this is really just the time it takes for the student to begin a behavior after a specific antecedent. So really it's just measuring the length of time between an antecedent and the beginning of the behavior. So maybe it's, okay, it's time to start your math homework, and then the latency would be how much time between that antecedent of it's time to start your math homework and the student actually beginning their math homework. So it's the length of time before a behavior starts. That might be something that you consider doing if you're trying to reduce the latency between a task demand and the student beginning an assignment. Another type of data collection is interval recording or time sampling. And there are two types. There's whole interval and partial interval recording. We'll talk a little bit about whole interval recording, though it's not used very frequently. If you're going to use whole interval recording, you might consider duration. It might be a better option, a little simpler. Whole interval recording involves identifying equal intervals across an observation period. So if you're going to be observing a student for 10 minutes, then you could divide that 10 minutes up into equal intervals. That could be 20, 30-second intervals. It could be 10, 1-minute intervals. But you would just divide that up into equal intervals and then observe the student for the entire interval, and then indicate whether the behavior occurred throughout the interval. That is, from the beginning of the interval to the end of the interval. So here's an example. Let's say that the behavior is being on task, and there's a definition of being on task there. The total observation time is 10 minutes. The length of each interval is 1 minute. And the 0 would mean that the behavior did not occur for the entire interval. That means if you're watching the student, that on task did not occur for the entire interval. But in interval number 2, it appears that on task did occur for the entire interval. So that entire 1 minute interval, that student was on task. Number 3, the same thing. For that entire 1 minute interval, that student was on task. Okay, so this is whole interval recording. We're looking at the entire interval. Did the behavior occur for the entire interval? If so, you indicate it with an X or a plus. If it didn't, then you indicate it with like a 0 or a minus or whatever coding scheme you've come up with. Okay, so that's whole interval recording. Partial interval recording, which is really useful in certain situations, especially during observational periods of unequal time. So let's say you wanted to observe a behavior, and one day you were only able to observe it for 10 minutes, and the other day you were only able to observe it for 8 minutes. Well, frequency counts or event recording during that time, maybe it would be hard to compare those two times because for one time period you had a total observation time of 10 minutes, but for another you had total observation time of 8 minutes. But partial interval recording would allow you to use observational periods of unequal time, and it's great for high frequency behaviors. So it's just like whole interval recording. You divide the observational time up into equal intervals. You observe for the entire interval, but you record whether the behavior occurred at any point during the interval, not for the entire interval. Cautionary note is that partial interval recording tends to overestimate behavior. So here's an example of partial interval recording. You have 5 minutes. You have 6 10-second intervals per minute. And then you would watch that student for 10 seconds. If the behavior occurred, you would circle the plus. If it didn't occur, you would circle the minus. And that is if it occurred at all. It doesn't have to occur throughout the entire interval. It's just if it occurred at any point during that interval. So I used partial interval recording for the study I did last year. And what we did is we set up some observations just like this. We did 5-minute observations with 10-second intervals per observation. And then we created an audio track that would cue the observers. So the audio track would say, observe, and you would observe, look at the student, see if the behavior is occurring for 10 seconds. And then the audio track would say, record. And it would give you 3 or 4 seconds during that observed period to record the behavior occurrences, either circle the plus or the minus. And then it would say observe again, and you would look back at the student and you would observe that student for 10 seconds, and then it would say record again, and you would look down and you would record. So usually when you're using any kind of time sampling, whether it's whole or partial interval or momentary time sampling, which we're not even going to talk about, but if you're using any sort of this time sampling, then you need some way to structure those observations to make sure that you're observing for equal amounts of time each interval, and that you give yourself a chance to record. So you could make an audio prompt like that. You could set up a timer, but you would need to do it in a systematic way so that you're making sure you're observing for the same number of intervals. So partial interval recording can be useful. It's similar to event recording, but it kind of is a combination of event recording and duration recording, because what you get at the end is an indicator of how many times the behavior occurred, but you also get a percent of intervals that it occurred in, which is similar to a duration type recording. So definitely consider interval recording or time sampling. If you are going to use interval recording, you're probably going to use partial interval as opposed to whole interval, but yeah, there's some options. So you also might be targeting teaching a skill, might be an academic skill or some functional skill, and so then you might use some task analytic data sheets where you're looking at a task analysis and you're indicating whether or not the student was able to demonstrate that step of the task analysis independently, or whether they needed or whether they needed prompting in order to do it independently. And so some data sheet like this might help you determine how many steps of the task analysis a student was able to complete, and then over time and with the introduction of your intervention, you would hope that they would be able to complete more steps of the task analysis independently. And so I like this data sheet because it has the where and the with, which allows you to look at the different settings that task analysis took place in, as well as who was the instructor, which can lead to information on generalization across settings and individuals. So here's a task analytic data sheet that you might consider using if you're teaching a skill, especially a chained skill or a skill that would require a task analysis. Here's another example of a data sheet if you were working with a student who you were trying to help them acquire a new skill. This is for repeated trial responses. So the task is for the student to identify sight words. And so you have the sight words that they're supposed to identify, and you have the indicators of whether they gave an independent correct or an incorrect response. It also allows you to indicate where and with whom the student was working. So this would be a way to look across the set of trials to see how a student responded correctly or incorrectly. Here's another example of how to look across the set of trials. Here's one for repeated opportunities. This is for a student to check their schedule. So they have a visual schedule, and the goal is for them to independently check their schedule throughout the day. And so you have whether or not they did that independent correct or whether they required some form of prompting in order to complete that. And then you have codes for where they were and who they were with, again, so you can look across individuals and settings to see how this behavior is being performed with multiple facilitators and across multiple environments. So you might consider something like this if you're identified a behavior that you're going to be teaching a skill with. So there's lots of data collection options. Dr. Roof gave you some great data sheets for latency and duration and event recording. And of course, there's lots of examples of these data sheets. I'll post some additional examples of the different data sheets we've talked about here on PolyLearn. I think it would be good for you guys to familiarize yourself with the different options that are out there for data collection. So as you start to think about your target behaviors, you can start to identify how it is you're going to measure those behaviors. And that'll be an important component of your proposal at the end of this quarter. So it's good to start thinking now about how you're going to measure these behaviors.